He mocked her as barren, but when Clara walked in with 3 infants, the billionaire realized some truths destroy empires and hearts forever. Hey everyone, welcome back to Mr. James' family. I'm James, and today we have a story that will tug at your heartstrings, full of drama, emotions, and life-changing twists. Sit back, get cozy, and let's dive into a story of love, heartbreak, and unexpected surprises. You won't believe what happens next. Elias Thorne smiled the way men smile when they are certain nothing in the room can touch them. Not joy, not warmth, ownership. It was the smile of a man who had measured the ceiling, the walls, the people, and decided they all existed within his reach. The chandeliers above him burned bright, crystal dripping light like frozen rain. Every reflection bounced back onto polished marble floors, onto silk gowns, diamond cuffs, and black tie suits worn by people who had learned how to laugh on command. This was his night, the annual Thorne Foundation Christmas charity auction. Cameras hovered at the edges of the ballroom like obedient insects, red lights blinking softly, waiting. Every angle mattered. Every expression would be archived, analyzed, replayed. Elias stood at the center of it all, tall, immaculate, controlled, a man sculpted by discipline and rewarded by ruthlessness. Servers moved silently, offering champagne flutes that caught the light like promises. Elias took one without looking, his fingers precise, practiced. He lifted the glass slowly, not to drink, but to command attention. The murmurs thinned, the laughter softened. The room leaned toward him. Elias let the silence stretch. Not too long, just long enough to remind them who decided when things began. His gaze drifted across the crowd, board members, donors, rivals pretending to be friends. He saw admiration, envy, fear, carefully hidden behind smiles. He enjoyed that part most. Legacy, he said at last, his voice low, smooth, perfectly amplified, is the only thing money can't buy. A ripple of approval moved through the room. Heads nodded, glasses lifted, polite laughter followed, the kind designed not to offend, not to stand out, the kind Elias expected. He smiled again, smaller this time. He liked building momentum. Anyone can earn wealth, he continued. Anyone can spend it. But legacy, he paused, eyes narrowing just slightly. Legacy demands sacrifice. Another pause, this one heavier. And clarity. He took a small sip of champagne, letting the taste linger. The room waited. They always did. And that, Elias said, his tone turning almost conversational, is why some marriages must end. The laughter came faster this time, sharper. A few people glanced around, unsure whether to laugh harder or stay quiet. Social instinct kicked in. Most laughed. Elias's eyes moved, almost imperceptibly, to the empty chair near the front, the seat reserved for Clara, the woman who once stood beside him in rooms like this, the woman whose presence used to soften his image, make him seem human. She wasn't there. She hadn't been invited. She was kind, Elias continued, voice still smooth, still calm. And kindness is admirable. He shrugged lightly, as if discussing market trends. But kindness doesn't build empires. A few nervous chuckles. And unfortunately, he added, tilting his head, neither do empty wombs. The room reacted before it thought. Laughter erupted, louder, less polite, unfiltered. Someone slapped a table. Another shook their head in amused disbelief. Elias smiled wider now. This was the moment he enjoyed most, the moment when cruelty disguised itself as honesty, and people rewarded it. But what no one noticed was his hand. The fingers around the champagne flute tightened, just slightly, enough for the glass to creak. Because somewhere beneath the tailored suit, Beneath the rehearsed confidence and carefully curated indifference, something shifted. Not guilt, not regret, something colder. A brief, unwelcome sensation slid down his spine, like the room had tilted by a fraction of a degree. Like a thought he hadn't approved had brushed against his mind. Elias dismissed it instantly. He didn't believe in omens. He believed in control. She couldn't give me what mattered, he continued, tone sharpening just enough to cut. And I refuse to apologize for choosing progress over sentiment. Applause broke out. Not thunderous, but eager. The kind that came from people who wanted to be seen agreeing. Elias nodded, acknowledging it like a king acknowledging loyalty. He scanned the room again, savoring the applause, the validation. Still, his chest felt tight, unreasonable, annoying. He shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself. This foundation exists, he said, redirecting smoothly, because success means nothing if it isn't preserved, shared, extended beyond one lifetime. He lifted his glass again. To futures that endure. To names that last, glasses rose. To Thorne, someone called out. Elias smiled. Yes, that part felt right. Yet, as the applause faded, the silence returned differently this time, thicker, less obedient. The chandeliers hummed faintly. Somewhere near the entrance, a draft brushed the back of his neck. Elias frowned just slightly. The ballroom doors, tall, heavy, carved with gold detailing, stood closed. He stared at them longer than necessary. Why? He didn't know. The tightness in his chest grew. He told himself it was nothing, a reaction to the champagne, to the lights, to standing too long. Still, his grip loosened and tightened again around the glass. A faint sound echoed, metal shifting. The hinges moved, and then the ballroom doors opened. The laughter hadn't fully died when the doors parted, and Elias Thorne, mid-smile, mid-victory, felt something irreversible begin. The ballroom doors opened. Cold air slipped inside first. Not wind, not noise, just a shift. The kind that makes instinct speak before thought does. Every head turned. Every conversation collapsed into silence. Clara Mendez stepped inside without hesitation. She did not rush. She did not pause. She entered as if she had always belonged there, and simply returned. Her heels touched marble with a quiet certainty, the sound measured, unhurried. The emerald silk of her dress moved with her, deep and restrained, catching light without begging for it. She stood tall, not stiff, not defiant, whole. She did not scan the room. She did not search for approval or allies. She already knew where Elias Thorne stood, and she did not look at him yet. In her arms were 3 infants, identical. Small faces turned inward, wrapped in ivory blankets, so clean they almost glowed under the chandeliers. Their breathing was soft, rhythmic. The sound barely reached the nearest tables, but it carried weight all the same. Alive. That was what struck the room first. Not the babies, not Clara. The fact that they were alive, present, undeniable. The ballroom froze, not dramatically, not all at once. It froze in fragments. A woman near the back stopped mid-sip, glass hovering near her lips. A donor's smile collapsed into confusion. Someone whispered a name they weren't sure belonged here. The silence thickened. Whispers followed, low and electric, moving faster than reason. Is that? Why is she? Those children? Elias Thorne's chair scraped sharply against the floor. The sound cut through the hush like a blade. He stood too fast, too obvious, too human. No, he muttered, the word escaping before he could contain it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't meant to be heard, but Clara heard it. She did not react. She began walking forward. Each step was deliberate, not theatrical, measured. The kind of walk that comes from long decisions already made. The infants stirred slightly as she moved. One shifted its head against her shoulder. Another stretched a tiny hand free from the blanket, fingers curling instinctively. That hand caught the thin chain at Clara's neck. She adjusted without breaking stride, her hand gentle, practiced. A mother's reflex. The crowd noticed that. More than the dress, more than the babies. The way she held them. As if this was not a display, as if this was simply life continuing in an inconvenient place. Elias remained standing. His glass sat forgotten on the table. His mouth opened once, then closed. His mind searched for explanations and found none that fit. Clara stopped a few feet away from him. Still, she did not look up. The infants' faces were close to hers. She watched them breathe, counted it, maybe, anchored herself. Only then did she lift her gaze. She looked at Elias. Not with anger, not with triumph, not with accusation, with sorrow. It landed harder than any slap. Because sorrow meant memory. It meant history. It meant she had not come to destroy him. She had come carrying something already broken. Elias felt his throat tighten. That terrified him. Rage he understood. Hatred he could deflect. Shame he could bury. But sorrow implied truth. The room leaned in without realizing it. No one spoke. No one dared. Clara's voice, when it came, was quiet, not weak, quiet with intention. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me," she said. A pause. "I look different when I'm not standing behind you." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Elias swallowed. "Clara," he said, forcing the name out like a test. "What is this?" She glanced briefly at the room, at the cameras, at the audience he had curated so carefully, then back at him. "This," she said, "is real life arriving without an invitation." The infants shifted again. One let out a soft sound, not a cry, just a breath that wanted attention. Clara rocked them slightly. The movement was unconscious. Elias watched it anyway. He had never seen her like this. Not like the wife who smiled beside him. Not like the woman he dismissed as gentle but insufficient. This Clara was steady, grounded, unmoved by the room. "Why are you here?" he asked. His voice was sharper than he intended. Good. Sharpness meant control. Clara did not answer immediately. She took one more step forward, close enough now that he could see the faint shadows beneath her eyes. Not exhaustion, experience. Close enough that the baby's scent, clean cotton and warmth, reached him. "You invited the world," she said. "You didn't think to exclude truth." A murmur rippled. Elias clenched his jaw. "You're holding children in the middle of my event," he said. "You know exactly what that implies." "Yes," Clara replied calmly. "I do." Another pause. "And you still walked in," he added. "Yes." The certainty in that single word unsettled him. One of the infants shifted again, eyes fluttering briefly before settling. Someone gasped quietly. The resemblance, still vague, still deniable, hovered just beneath recognition. Elias noticed the looks. He hated that he noticed. "Security," he said without turning. No one moved. Not yet. Clara's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something close to sadness. "You always believed power would answer before people," she said. "Sometimes it doesn't." Elias finally looked around. Faces stared back. Not mocking, not laughing. Watching, waiting. The control he had felt minutes ago slipped, not fully, but enough to be felt. "Say what you came to say," he said tightly. "And leave." Clara inhaled slowly. The kind of breath that steadies a person before they speak something irreversible. "These children," she said, "have no idea where they are." Another pause. "They don't know your name." Elias's chest tightened. "They don't know this room," she continued. "They don't know power or reputation or legacy." Her eyes held his. "They only know who holds them when they wake up." Silence pressed in. The words were simple. That made them dangerous. You mocked absence tonight, Clara said quietly. You spoke about what wasn't here. She gestured slightly, with her chin, not her hands. I brought what was. Elias felt the room slipping further from him. He had built this night on certainty, on control, on the assumption that the past stayed buried. The infants shifted again. This time one made a small sound that carried. Not loud, but unmistakable. Alive. Elias's gaze dropped despite himself. 3 faces, so small, so identical. His heart did something strange. It stumbled. He straightened immediately. No, he would not be pulled into sentiment. Not here. Not like this. Clara, he said again, lower now. You don't understand what you're doing. She met his eyes steadily. I understand exactly what I'm doing, she replied. The room held its breath. Elias opened his mouth to deny what his eyes were already beginning to recognize, and in that suspended second, the truth moved closer than he could stop. Elias opened his mouth to speak. Nothing came out. For a fraction of a second, the room disappeared. The chandeliers blurred. The audience faded into an indistinct mass of soundless faces. All that existed were the 3 infants in Clara's arms, and the way his body reacted before his mind could stop it. No. The word finally surfaced, raw and instinctive, dragged up from somewhere defensive and panicked. You brought children here, Elias hissed, his voice dropping low as she closed the last inch of distance between them. To humiliate me. The question carried heat, accusation, fear disguised as anger. Clara did not flinch. She adjusted her grip on the infants, careful not to jostle them. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, as if the world had slowed to her rhythm alone. No, she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, grounded, not loud enough for the room, not soft enough to be ignored. I brought truth. The word settled heavily between them. Truth. It was not a word Elias welcomed easily. In his world, truth was flexible, negotiable, useful only when it served a purpose. This truth felt different, uncooperative. A breath moved through the crowd, sharp, collective. Clara shifted one infant slightly outward, just enough, not presenting, not accusing, simply allowing the light to fall where it naturally would. The baby's face turned toward Elias, and the resemblance landed, not dramatically, not with theatrical precision. It arrived quietly, decisively. His eyes, the same shape, the same spacing, the same dark ring around the iris that had once made magazine covers linger on his gaze, his bone structure, that unmistakable line from cheek to jaw. Strong even now, softened only by infancy. His blood. The room reacted before Elias could think. A gasp, then another, then a whisper, sharp and disbelieving, slipping through the silence like a blade. They look like him. Elias's throat tightened. He felt it physically, like something had closed around his windpipe. He forced a breath. They're not mine, he said. The words came out too quickly, too practiced, too desperate. Clara nodded, not in agreement, in understanding. That's what she believed, too. The sentence landed softly and cut deep. Elias stared at her. Who? He snapped. The edge in his voice was real now, fraying, losing polish. Clara's jaw tightened, just slightly. A tell Elias remembered. It had always appeared when she was choosing restraint over emotion. A woman you don't remember, she said. The words were quiet. They carried no drama, which made them devastating. Elias scoffed reflexively. I don't forget women. Clara's eyes held his. You forget consequences, she corrected. The babies stirred again, sensing the shift. One let out a small, uneasy sound. Another's face creased, breath hitching. A whimper escaped. Soft, unaccusing. But it echoed. Elias felt something crack inside his chest. Not fully. Just enough to hurt. Just enough to change the way he stood. He looked away for a fraction of a second. The room noticed. Clara noticed. "You're wrong," he said, turning back. "You're reaching. You're doing this because you're angry." "No," she replied. "I'm doing this because they exist." She glanced down at the infants. "They existed before tonight," she continued. "Before your speech. Before your jokes." Her gaze lifted again. "They existed when you walked away." The accusation was not in her tone. It was in the timeline. Elias's mind raced. Madrid, galas, hotels, faces blending into one another. A memory stirred. Unclear, unimportant, or so he had believed. "You're saying I—" He stopped, swallowed. "This is absurd," Clara exhaled slowly. "You always called inconvenient truths absurd," she said. "It helped you sleep." The room shifted. People leaned forward without realizing it. No one interrupted. No one dared. "These children," Elias said, lowering his voice further, "are not proof." Clara's lips curved faintly, not into a smile. "They're not proof," she agreed. "They're consequence." Another pause. "You never stayed long enough to learn names," she continued. "You left before responsibility had a face." Elias's chest rose sharply. "You expect me to believe this now?" he demanded. "In front of everyone?" "I didn't come to convince you," Clara said. "I came to confront you." The distinction mattered. Elias felt his footing slip again. One of the infants opened its eyes briefly, dark, curious, unaware. The baby's gaze drifted, and for the briefest moment settled on Elias's face. His breath caught. He didn't know why. He didn't want to know why. "You're using them," he said hoarsely. "You're weaponizing children." Clara's expression hardened for the first time. "Don't," she warned. "Don't reduce them to tools. That's your language, not mine." The room held its breath. Elias straightened. "You don't even know if they're mine," he said. Clara met his stare evenly. "I know their mother believed they were yours," she said. "I know she waited." Elias froze. "Waited for what?" he asked. "For you," Clara replied. The word lingered. Waited, as if time itself had betrayed her. "She waited until her body couldn't anymore," Clara continued. "She waited until the doctors stopped promising." Elias shook his head. "You're lying." "No," Clara said quietly. "She was." That stopped him. "She was what?" he asked. "Alone." The babies whimpered again, louder this time. Clara adjusted them instinctively, pressing them closer to her chest. Her voice softened, but it did not weaken. "She died believing her children had no father," she said. The sentence settled like ash. Elias felt heat behind his eyes. He turned away again, only for a moment. But again, people noticed. "This is a story," he said. "A tragic one. But it's not mine." Clara stepped closer, not invading, anchoring. "Stories don't breathe," she said. "They don't cry when rooms get loud." The infant's whimper broke into a small cry, sharp, alive. Elias flinched. He hadn't meant to, but he did. The sound pierced something he had armored for decades. For the first time that night, he didn't know what to say. Elias looked down at the crying child and realized the question forming in his chest was no longer whether they were his, but what it would cost him if they were. Elias blinked. His mouth opened once, then closed again. The truth clawed at the edges of his mind like smoke he couldn't breathe through. Clara didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She didn't have to. The words themselves carried the weight, heavy enough to settle over the room like winter snow. "You met her during a charity gala in Madrid," Clara said. Her tone was measured, calm, slicing through the residual tension that still clung to the chandelier's glow. "She worked logistics. You stayed 2 nights, promised to call." Elias felt color drain from his face, not just the surface. The blood in his chest seemed to recede, leaving him hollow. "She tried," Clara continued. She wrote letters, sent emails. When she found out she was pregnant, she believed you'd come. Every word was deliberate, no embellishment, no melodrama, just truth. Cold, precise, unyielding. Elias's mind raced, trying to sift through memory fragments he had long buried under triumph and arrogance. Faces blurred, hotel rooms, a brief touch of hands in a crowded hall, a woman's laugh, her eyes glinting when she dared to challenge him. He had forgotten, dismissed, moved on as he always did. And now she was gone. Clara paused, breathed, and in that pause Elias realized how much he had lost, not in possessions, not in status, but in humanity. She died during childbirth, Clara said, her voice steady but fragile, alone, believing her children had no father. Silence crashed down. It was suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The murmurs of the crowd faded into a dull hum, as if the room itself recognized the gravity. Elias whispered, barely audible, "Why are they with you?" Clara's eyes glistened, reflecting the ambient light of chandeliers like twin pools of something he couldn't quite name. Grief, determination, perhaps both. Her voice did not break. She did not falter. Because no one else came. The simplicity of it struck harder than any accusation. Not anger, not revenge, just responsibility. Quiet, relentless, undeniable responsibility. Elias's lips parted. No words formed. He wanted to speak, to argue, to reclaim some semblance of control, but every instinct in him knew it was futile. Clara took a slow step forward. Her dress shimmered in emerald waves with her motion. But it wasn't the shimmer that drew attention. It was the authority of her presence. She was not threatening. She was undeniable. "These children," she said softly, rocking the infants slightly, "have known more fear in the world than you've ever imagined. Their mother died thinking you abandoned them. They had no one, no safety, no name." Elias swallowed. The taste of blood, or maybe bile, rose in his throat. He looked at the infants again. 3 small lives, innocent, fragile, yet full of force. The weight of his absence, the depth of what he failed to see, pressed against him like an invisible hand. Clara's gaze never left his. "You mocked absence tonight," she said. "You ridiculed what you did not see, what you thought was empty, meaningless. And yet," she tilted her head slightly, almost as if studying him the way one examines fragile glass. "Here they are, alive, existing, defying the neglect you left behind." The room was still. The cameras clicked faintly in the distance, but they felt like echoes from another world. No one dared interrupt the fragile tension. Elias's hands, previously clenched, fell to his sides. His chest rose and fell unevenly. He wanted to retreat, to deny, to flee. Yet every instinct that had ever made him a titan in boardrooms, in auctions, in life itself, failed him now. Clara continued. "They are not just reminders," she whispered. "They are testimony, to love, to patience, to courage. Things you will never understand." Elias shook his head slowly, in disbelief. This isn't real," he said, though his voice was trembling. You can't do this to me, to my reputation, to everything I've built." Clara's lips quirked, not in amusement, not in malice, but in something like quiet inevitability. "Reputation," she said softly, "is meaningless when weighed against life, when weighed against truth." One of the infants stirred, stretching a tiny hand toward Elias. He froze. The gesture felt deliberate, accusatory, almost sentient. He wanted to look away. He wanted to pretend it was coincidence, but he could not. "Did she leave you letters?" he asked finally, voice hoarse. Did she try to make you care?" Clara's gaze hardened. "She tried everything, Every day she could have reached you, she did. Every plea, every hope, every prayer. Ignored. Elias's hands clenched into fists again, shaking slightly this time. Pain, anger, guilt, they collided in a storm he had no shield for. And through it all, Clara's calm authority remained untouched. You left her, Clara said, her voice steady, each word deliberate. You left her to face a world she didn't choose alone. And now, she exhaled slowly, now you see the result. Elias's jaw worked. No words could form. He wanted to run, to erase, to vanish. But the infant's presence was relentless. They existed. They demanded acknowledgement. Clara leaned slightly forward, just enough for her voice to pierce him. They survived because someone cared when you would not. A bead of sweat formed at the corner of Elias's temple. He could feel it, a slow, creeping awareness settling into his bones. Everything he had controlled in his life, his empire, his public image, his unchallenged authority, felt smaller than it had for the first time. He began, but Clara's gaze cut through him, halting the word midair. You will speak when you can, she said quietly. Not now. Not until you understand what absence costs. Elias's eyes dropped to the infants again. The realization was unbearable. Not that they might be his. Not that their mother died believing he abandoned them, but that he had done nothing while life demanded everything of him. The crowd was forgotten. The lights seemed dimmer. The air tighter. Everything he had thought mattered felt hollow. He had built castles, he had conquered worlds, and yet he was powerless here. The infants whimpered softly. Clara adjusted them, holding them closer. You created this, she said softly, almost to herself. Through neglect, through absence, through choice. Elias's hands twitched at his sides. He could not touch them, could not approach. Fear, shame, and something unnameable rooted him in place. Clara's eyes softened slightly, but only slightly. Don't mistake my compassion for weakness, she said. I will protect what matters, whether you like it or not. And you will learn that power without responsibility is nothing. The sound of one infant's soft cry echoed, fragile yet insistent. It carried farther than words, piercing the brittle shell he had wrapped around himself for years. Elias realized then that this night would change him, not with contracts, not with deals, but with truth, the raw, undeniable living proof of everything he had ignored. He wanted to avert his gaze, wanted to pretend she had exaggerated, wanted to convince himself he could walk away and everything would remain the same. But it would not, because for the first time he understood what absence could create and what neglect could never undo. Clara's eyes held his, unflinching, unwavering. The infants in her arms moved slightly, as if aware the tension was about to snap. They were headed to foster care, she said softly, carefully, as though measuring each word against the gravity of its meaning. Her voice did not rise, yet it filled the room more completely than any speech Elias had ever delivered. 3 identical babies. No family. No name. Elias's fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He wanted to reach out, to argue, to insist, to reclaim some fragment of control. But something in him, something long buried under wealth and arrogance, froze him in place. You should have told me, he finally said, voice rough, almost pleading. Clara shook her head slowly, deliberately. Her movements were measured, like the deliberate ticking of a clock that reminded him he had run out of time long ago. I watched how easily you discarded women, she said, each word crisp, deliberate, once they stopped serving you. Her gaze bore into him, not accusing, not angry, not bitter, but factual. Cold truth exposed like raw bone. She leaned slightly closer, the infants pressing against her, oblivious to the drama, yet tethering it to reality. I wouldn't risk their lives on your convenience, she said quietly. Her words struck harder than any insult could have. It wasn't just what she said, it was what she implied. The distance between intention and action, between neglect and responsibility, had always been his domain. She had crossed into it. The crowd stopped existing as a crowd. They were no longer donors, reporters, or observers. They were witnesses, spectators of a reckoning they had never expected to witness at a charity gala. Eyes shifted, hands folded, breath caught. Clara did not hesitate. She took a slow breath and continued. I adopted them, she said, voice steady, deliberate, unwavering. Legally, completely. I gave them a home you would have turned into a transaction. One of the infants stirred, not from fear, not from noise, simply a small stretch, a tiny movement of life asserting itself. And in that movement one baby smiled softly in sleep, a curl of lips, a subtle lift, fragile yet undeniable. Elias felt something unfamiliar rise in his throat. Not anger, not pride, regret. Raw, unfiltered, impossible to deny. He looked at Clara again, at the way she held the babies with careful reverence, at the calm authority she exuded despite the chaos of the room, at the undeniable courage it took to walk into his arena carrying the consequence of his absence. His mind spun, trying to grasp the reality that had been thrust into his lap. 3 lives that were his by blood, yet she had claimed them through choice. Choice. Something he had never understood as fully as he did now. Elias tried to argue, to reclaim some semblance of superiority. You could have told me, he repeated, weaker this time, a tremor threading through the words. You could have. Clara's gaze cut him off. You would have found a reason not to care, she said softly, yet every syllable carried steel. You would have rationalized it, delegated it, dismissed it, just as you always do. He opened his mouth again, searching for defense, for denial, for distraction. But the weight of truth anchored him. You don't understand, he finally said, voice cracking slightly, betraying emotion he had never shown publicly. I didn't know. Clara's lips pressed together. She did not smile. I doubt you ever would have, she replied. The simplicity of the statement, its honesty, left him exposed, raw, trembling in ways he had never imagined possible. Elias's hands shook, his fingers twitched. He wanted to reach out, to touch, to fix, but he could not. These were not objects to be repaired, not pawns to be moved. These were lives, real fragile breathing lives he had ignored. She adjusted the infants slightly, holding them closer to her chest. They deserved more than waiting, more than silence, more than your absence. Her voice softened slightly, almost imperceptibly, as she continued. And now they have it. They have love, protection, safety, the things that should have been yours to give, but weren't. Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to argue with her logic, to insist that he could have provided, would have provided, but the words felt hollow, empty, insufficient. He remembered her mother's death, the woman whose life had been quietly destroyed by his neglect. The weight of that truth pressed down like an avalanche he could neither stop nor escape. He thought of the letters she had sent, the calls he had ignored, the small hopes she had carried quietly while he pursued fortune and notoriety. Regret grew heavier, not sorrow, not guilt alone, a crushing, undeniable, suffocating regret. One infant opened its eyes fully, dark and observant. It looked at him, and though it could not speak, it asked a question he could not answer. The question of presence, the question of responsibility, the question of what he had failed to do. The room remained silent. The spectators watched, unsure whether to speak, move, or intervene. But none could. None dared. Clara spoke again, voice low but carrying through the stillness. I chose them because no one else did, Because someone had to. Her words lingered. Elias felt the weight of every unspoken consequence press into him. He wanted to take a step forward. He wanted to claim them. But he could not. Not yet. Not while the reality of his failures hung in the air like smoke. One baby stirred again. Soft, delicate movements, asserting life and claiming space. The gesture was small, but monumental, and it reminded Elias that action or inaction had consequences far beyond his understanding. Clara's eyes softened slightly, not in surrender but in understanding. She had done what he had never done. She had stepped into chaos and claimed it. She had chosen life over absence, love over convenience. Elias swallowed. The lump in his throat refused to dissipate. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, not in business, not in wealth, not in influence, but powerless to reclaim what he had never earned: trust, love, responsibility. The infant's soft whimpers filled the room, fragile yet insistently alive. Each cry, each breath reminded him of what he had lost, what he had ignored, what he had failed to protect. Clara's voice cut through the silence again. "They are not just reminders of your failure," she said. "They are evidence of what happens when someone else acts with courage." Elias looked at her. Her calm authority, her fierce protection of life he had abandoned. He realized painfully that she had won, not by confrontation, not by spectacle, but by sheer, quiet force of action. And for the first time he felt the edges of his empire, his control, his power, slip beneath him. Clara adjusted the infants, rocking them gently. She held them close, and Elias could see it all: love, choice, courage, the life he had ignored. And in that moment he understood something he could never undo. He had created a void. She had filled it, and that void would never be his again. Elias's lips trembled as he struggled for words. Before he could speak, Clara leaned slightly closer, her next sentence carrying a revelation so profound it would shatter his understanding of his past, his choices, and the lives he had abandoned. Forever. Elias's voice was rough, hoarse from disuse, or perhaps from emotion he had refused to acknowledge. "Why?" he asked, not loud, not demanding, fragile, almost broken. "After what I did to you?" Clara's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady, quiet, deliberate, carrying weight without effort. "Because love isn't something you ration," she said. Her hands moved instinctively over the infants, rocking one slightly, smoothing the blanket over another. The babies responded, their tiny movements syncing with her touch. Elias watched, really watched. For the first time in years, he observed without judgment, without distraction. The room felt suddenly smaller. The crowd's murmurs, the flashing cameras, the chandelier's brilliance, all receded. All that existed was her, the children, and the truth she embodied. "You once told me I was too soft," she said, voice softening just enough to pierce the edges of his armor. "Too emotional." He flinched slightly. He remembered. He remembered her words, the first time she had challenged him, the way she had looked him in the eye and said it, with conviction. He had dismissed it then, proud, angry, unwilling to see the lesson. Now he could not look away. She held his gaze firmly, unflinching, unyielding. "But softness is why they survived," she said. The words landed slowly, deliberately, like stones being placed on a scale. Elias felt them pressing against him, heavy, undeniable. The ones he had ignored, underestimated, mocked. Those traits had saved lives. His chest tightened, his hands twitched at his sides. He wanted to speak, to deny, to rationalize. But words felt meaningless against the truth she wielded effortlessly. He looked down at the infants again, tiny, alive, breathing proof of courage, patience, and unspoken sacrifice. and he realized that all his wealth, his power, his public image meant nothing against this moment. The crowd's whispers were soft now, almost reverent. Even they seemed to sense that something profound had shifted. Elias's shoulders slumped slightly, a small concession, a crack in the armor he had spent decades building. For the first time, the billionaire looked small, not weak, not powerless, but human. Clara adjusted the babies again, keeping her movements deliberate, soothing, protective. "You left them," she said, voice low but unwavering. "You left her. You left them. You left yourself behind in pursuit of things that vanish like smoke." He swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel the walls of his life, boardrooms, contracts, auctions, influence, crumbling in his mind. They were irrelevant here. "Do you understand?" she asked softly, leaning slightly closer, her voice threaded with both sorrow and strength. "This could have been you. You could have saved them. You could have been the man they needed." The words were a challenge, not to fight, not to argue, but to reflect, to face what he had avoided. Elias looked away, struggling against the lump forming in his throat. The infants stirred again, and one of them reached a tiny hand outward, curling fingers against the edge of her silk sleeve. The gesture was instinctive, innocent, but to Elias it felt accusatory. Clara watched him, unwavering. She did not demand words. She did not force confession. She only waited. And in the silence, Elias felt the weight of his mistakes, every neglect, every absence, every moment he had prioritized himself over responsibility. It all pressed into him like a storm he had no defense against. He began, voice low, unsteady. But Clara's eyes held him in place. "You don't get to speak yet," she said. "Not until you understand what courage looks like. Not until you realize that life doesn't wait for convenience or apologies." The infants whimpered softly, tiny voices carrying far more meaning than any speech, any contract, any deal he had ever brokered. And in that sound, Elias recognized something profound: the consequences of absence, the weight of leaving a life to chance. He clenched his fists again, but the movement was smaller, restrained. For the first time, he realized that strength was not in control or power, but in action, in sacrifice, in love he had long dismissed as weakness. Clara's gaze softened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but it did not waver from him. She was steady. She was unyielding. She embodied the life he had abandoned. And in that embodiment, Elias felt both awe and fear. The room felt impossibly quiet. Even the chandeliers dazzling above seemed to dim in acknowledgement. "You have spent years believing armor protects you," Clara said, "believing distance keeps you safe, believing money can replace presence. But it cannot." He swallowed hard, feeling the truth like fire rising in his chest. He had been shielded by arrogance, by pride, by control. But now, stripped bare by love and courage, he was exposed. He looked at the babies again, 3 fragile lives he could not touch, could not claim. All he could do was watch. Clara's voice was quiet now, intimate, almost a whisper meant for him alone. They needed someone who would stay, someone who would not turn away, someone who could love them without hesitation. Her hands brushed lightly over their tiny forms, gentle, protective. Elias's chest ached in ways he could not name. For the first time he realized that his entire life had prepared him for everything except this moment. "You could have been that man," Clara said, "but you weren't, and now—" Her eyes held his with unwavering truth. "Now you must choose. You can stay in the fortress of wealth and reputation, or you can step into responsibility and humanity. But the choice is yours alone." Elias's mind raced. The words echoed in his skull. Responsibility, humanity, life. And beneath the fear, beneath the pride, he felt a flicker, a spark of something he thought he had buried forever. The infants stirred again. One reached a tiny hand outward. It was small, innocent, and yet it carried the weight of judgment. Elias swallowed. He wanted to step forward, because for the first time he understood that words alone could not reclaim what he had lost. Only action, only courage, only love. And he had never acted like that before. Elias's eyes lifted to meet Clara's. Before he could answer, she spoke again, her next words a revelation that would force him to confront not just his failures, but a truth about the past that would shake him to his core and challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the life he had built. Clara straightened. She shifted the infants in her arms, holding them with quiet reverence, their tiny breaths steady against her chest. Then, without hesitation, she turned toward the audience. The chandeliers reflected in her eyes like stars scattered across a midnight sky. "These children carry the Thorne blood," she said, voice calm, deliberate, echoing across the hall. The words fell like stones into a pond. Ripples of disbelief spread immediately. Gasps, murmurs, whispered exchanges. Eyes widened. Some covered mouths. Others stared, stunned into silence. Elias felt the weight of every gaze in the room land squarely on him. His chest tightened. The pride he had worn like armor now felt like iron chains. "They carry my name now," Clara continued, unwavering. Her voice cut through the soft hum of the shocked crowd, clear, resonant, like a bell tolling truth. "Because legacy isn't about power, it's about protection." The murmurs grew louder, yet no one dared interrupt her. Her authority filled the space like fire filling a dark room. She wasn't demanding respect. She was commanding it simply by existing, by acting with the moral courage Elias had never understood. Elias's throat constricted. He wanted to argue, to insist, to reclaim the space he had once thought untouchable, but every instinct, every lesson, every experience had failed him here. She was right. "You wanted heirs," Clara said, her gaze piercing him. "You created them, but you weren't worthy of them." A flashbulb exploded nearby, and cameras clicked frenetically. Reporters leaned forward, guests murmured with disbelief. Yet Elias remained still, silent, anchored only by the crushing weight of truth. Clara's words did more than shame him. They cut deeper, not for show, not for scandal, but because they revealed what he had never faced. His absence had consequences, his indifference had cost lives, and someone else, someone better, had acted when he could not. The infants stirred. One yawned, stretching tiny arms as if asserting their right to exist. Elias watched, frozen, helpless. He could not even blink fast enough to distract from the truth they embodied. Clara's voice softened, but the impact of her words only intensified. "Names matter," she said, almost tenderly. "But what matters more is what you stand for, what you fight for, what you protect." The room seemed impossibly quiet. Even the faint clinking of glasses from the charity auction faded into an almost sacred stillness. Elias felt a sharp pang, a hollow ache in his chest, deeper than any failure he had endured in business, deeper than any loss of money, deeper than any boardroom defeat. This was personal. This was real. This was irrevocable. He realized with slow, agonizing clarity that Clara had rewritten not just the children's future, but the very story of his life. A story he had thought belonged only to him. A legacy he had believed untouchable. "You think legacy is gold," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "You think it's power. You think it's names on buildings, contracts, foundations. But legacy is love. Legacy is protection. Legacy is choosing life when you could choose anything else." Elias could feel the room's attention tightening around him, every pair of eyes a silent judge, every whisper a weight. And yet, none of it mattered as much as the truth emanating from the woman before him. He swallowed hard, but his throat felt dry. His hands itched to move, to reach, to grasp something tangible, yet he was paralyzed by the immensity of the reality Clara had laid bare. Clara's gaze softened just slightly at the edges of her steely resolve. "But you never learned that lesson," she said. "You never understood what it meant to care without calculation, to protect without expectation, to love without hesitation." Elias's stomach tightened. He felt a surge of shame so raw it threatened to unbalance him completely. He had walked through life believing he controlled everything, and here, at the pinnacle of wealth, amidst applause and cameras and influence, he was utterly powerless. "You were asked to act," Clara continued, voice steady, deliberate, piercing through the lingering murmurs of the room. "You were given a chance to be a father, to be more than a name, to be more than wealth. And you failed, spectacularly, irrevocably." Elias's eyes met hers. They were unwavering, strong, true. The kind of eyes that demanded recognition, demanded accountability. He wanted to look away, but he could not. "She acted when you would not," Clara said softly, almost tenderly now. "She chose life. She chose love. She chose responsibility. And I—" Her voice cracked slightly, just enough to remind him of human fragility. "I followed her example. I carried it forward. I gave them a home, a name, a life worthy of them." Elias felt the weight of her words crush the remaining defenses he had. A hollow, aching sensation spread through him. He had imagined life as a chessboard, every move controlled, every outcome manipulated. But this was not a game. The infants cooed softly. One stretched a tiny hand outward. It was a gesture simple and innocent, yet it felt like judgment. The hand was small, but the message was enormous. Clara shifted slightly, holding them tighter. "You cannot take this from me," she said, her voice low but commanding. "You cannot reclaim what you neglected. You cannot erase the choices I made to save them." Elias felt an unfamiliar sensation, fear, not of death, not of failure, not of exposure, fear of himself, fear of what he had allowed, fear of what he had lost, fear of the life he might never reclaim. The cameras flashed, the audience gasped. But the only thing that mattered was the truth in Clara's words, in her choices, in the children she protected. His empire, his wealth, his power, nothing mattered. All he had built, all he had controlled, all he had manipulated, irrelevant in the presence of courage and love. He realized then that names could be rewritten, legacies could be redefined, and that his, Elias Thorne's, greatest failure was not the loss of wealth or reputation, it was the absence of love. She looked at him again, directly, steadily. "You wanted heirs," she said quietly, almost intimately. "You thought blood alone could carry your name forward, but blood without care, without protection, is nothing. They are mine, because I chose them when you would not." Elias's hands trembled. His mind raced, unable to comprehend how everything he thought he knew had been overturned by a single act of courage. He felt smaller, helpless, exposed. Clara's gaze softened one last time. Not pity, not triumph, not malice, only truth. And in that truth, Elias understood the starkest reality of all. He had lost more than he ever imagined. He had lost his chance at what mattered most. The infants stirred again, tiny cries filling the room. They were alive. They were protected. They had a name, and it was not his. Elias swallowed hard. His chest heaved slightly. He opened his mouth to speak. But no words came. He had nothing to say, because she was right. Clara took a step closer to Elias, the infants in her arms, and whispered words meant for him alone, a revelation about the mother he had abandoned, the secret she had kept, and the truth of the children's lives that would shatter every illusion he held about himself and force him to face a choice he could no longer avoid. The auction ended abruptly, not with fanfare, not with applause, but with silence, the kind of silence that presses down, heavy, suffocating, inescapable. Sponsors withdrew quietly, murmuring excuses, adjusting collars, avoiding the intensity in the room. Board members glanced down at their notes, shuffled papers, even left chairs empty where they had once sat boldly. Elias remained near the stage, alone. His tailored suit suddenly felt like armor that no longer fit, like a weight he could not bear. His hands twitched at his sides. The familiar power that had defined him felt hollow, meaningless. Clara moved carefully, infants resting against her chest. She walked with quiet authority, yet her steps carried no fear, no hesitation. The room seemed to recede around her, the chandeliers and golden decorations fading into insignificance. "Clara," Elias said, voice trembling. The words cracked slightly, raw and human, the first unguarded sound he had made all evening. "I don't deserve forgiveness." She paused, not moving, not blinking. Her gaze met his fully. "No," she said softly, deliberately. "You don't." His shoulders sagged. The tension he had carried for years, the pride, the arrogance, the illusion of invulnerability, they collapsed under the weight of her words. He felt small, vulnerable, exposed. "But," she continued, her voice gentle yet unwavering, "they deserve better than the man you were." Her hands adjusted the infants. One of them whimpered softly, curling against her. Elias watched, feeling a hollow ache in his chest that he could not name. Tears formed, not just in his eyes, but deep in his bones, finally, unchecked, unhidden, unstoppable. He had always believed that control, money, power could shield him from consequence. Tonight proved that false. He had destroyed lives, not intentionally, perhaps, but through absence, neglect, and pride. And now the evidence of that destruction was living, breathing, undeniable. Clara's eyes softened slightly as she watched him. Not with pity, not with triumph, but with sorrow and quiet strength. "You didn't just lose reputation tonight," she said, voice low, deliberate. "You lost something far more important, the chance to be present, to care, to act when it mattered." Elias swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to rationalize, to offer excuses. But nothing fit here. Nothing could undo the choices he had made, or failed to make. The room felt impossibly still. Even the chandeliers seemed muted, as though bearing witness to the collapse of a carefully constructed life. Clara shifted slightly, holding the infants closer. "They were not just your children by blood," she continued. "They were lives that needed protection. They were hopes, promises, trust. And you abandoned that responsibility." Elias's throat tightened. His mind raced back to the mother, the woman he had used, discarded, ignored. He remembered the letters she sent, the hope she carried in every word. And now the children she left behind had been saved, not by him, but by the woman he once loved, the woman who had remained loyal even in absence. "I," he began, but the word faltered. Tears fell freely down his face, not because he feared exposure, not because he cared for the eyes of the audience, but because he finally saw the lives he had destroyed, the innocence he had neglected, the love he had denied. Clara's voice was calm, almost tender now. "I didn't bring them here to punish you," she said softly. "I brought them to show you the consequences of absence, to show you what you failed to understand for so long, and perhaps to give you a chance to choose differently going forward." Elias's hands trembled. He wanted to reach for them, to cradle them, to make amends. But he hesitated. He feared he might not know how. He feared that his presence now might not matter. The infants stirred, small movements that made his heart ache. Tiny hands stretched, tiny eyes blinked open, trusting, innocent, alive. They were proof of life he had ignored, proof of a world that continued despite him, proof that someone else had acted when he had failed. The crowd was silent. The air hung heavy, charged with emotion and truth. Even the staff and board members seemed frozen, waiting, watching, unwilling to intervene in what had become more than a spectacle. Clara adjusted the babies in her arms. Her gaze softened, but only slightly, as if she were granting him a glimpse of grace. "Elias," she said, voice gentle yet firm, "you cannot undo the past, but you can choose what you do now. You can choose to be the man they need, not the man you once were." Elias closed his eyes, trembling, chest heaving. Every lesson he had ignored in life, every warning he had dismissed, every person he had discarded, all converged in this moment. He realized that forgiveness might never come from them, from her or from anyone, but redemption. Perhaps that was still within reach. He opened his eyes slowly, and for the first time he truly saw Clara, not as the woman he had underestimated, mocked, or left behind, but as the one who had done what he could not, as the one who carried life, love, and courage when he failed to. The tears continued to fall, not of shame alone, not of regret alone, but of awe, of understanding, of the enormity of what he had ignored. He felt exposed, vulnerable, human. The mask he had worn for decades, the confident, untouchable billionaire, had fallen, shattered, irrevocably. Clara's voice softened, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the hall. "They are safe," she said. "They have love. They have a home. They have someone who acts when action is needed. And now, you must decide if you will be part of that or remain in the shadows of what you failed to do." Elias swallowed, nodding slowly. He could feel the weight of her words in every fiber of his being. The room seemed smaller, the air thicker. Every heartbeat echoed the gravity of this reckoning. He looked at the infants again, 3 fragile, perfect lives. And finally, he understood. It was not money, not power, not influence. They had none of that here. What mattered was love. What mattered was choice. What mattered was courage. He closed his eyes, breath shuddering, hands trembling at his sides. For the first time he felt utterly, irreversibly powerless in the face of truth. And yet, he felt a spark he hadn't felt in years, a flicker of something he could grasp, nurture, and build upon, if he chose to. The infants shifted, small arms reaching outward. The gesture, innocent yet deliberate, felt like a challenge, a demand, a reminder that life would not wait for hesitation. Clara's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Elias," she said softly, leaning slightly closer, "do you understand what they needed from the start?" He nodded slowly, voice caught in his throat. Tears fell freely, unhidden, unstoppable. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I understand." The weight of years, of absence, of neglect pressed on him. But within that weight, a fragile, trembling resolve began to form. Perfect. Here's Chapter 9 fully expanded, starting exactly where Chapter 8 ended. Clara about to reveal the final truth of the woman he abandoned and the children's origins. Months had passed. The world outside had shifted quietly into winter, and Clara's home reflected that calm. A small Christmas tree glowed gently in the corner of the living room, lights twinkling like soft promises. The aroma of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air. It was cozy, modest, far from the grandeur of the auction halls, the glittering chandeliers, the cameras, the chaos. Here life had a slower rhythm, a safer, gentler pulse. Elias sat on the floor, knees bent, his posture awkward. For someone who had always carried the world on his shoulders, he now carried only himself. and it felt different. One of the infants reached a tiny hand and wrapped it around his finger. He froze for a heartbeat, then allowed himself to smile, tentative, careful. Clara watched from the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. Her eyes measured him, not with suspicion, not with expectation, but with quiet awareness. This was a man learning the weight of choice, of presence, of love. He looked up at her, and for the first time, there were no walls between them, no masks, no performance. "Thank you," he said, voice gentle, careful, almost shy. "Thank you for becoming who I wasn't." Clara smiled faintly, a small, soft gesture. "Change isn't loud," she said quietly. "It's consistent, it's patient, it's measured." The babies cooed softly, one stretching tiny arms toward Elias. He laughed quietly, a sound foreign to his own ears, soft, unpracticed, human. He had spent decades mastering control, building empires, commanding attention. And now, here in a modest living room, surrounded by the soft glow of lights and three tiny lives, he felt powerless. And it was the most liberating sensation he had ever known. Outside, snow fell softly, thick and pure. The world seemed to pause. Even the cold carried warmth here, in this home, this moment, this life Clara had created. He looked down at the infants, then back at Clara. "The Thorne name," he began hesitantly, unsure what to say. "I always thought it meant power, legacy, influence. But—" He paused, searching for the words, unaccustomed to such humility. "I see now. It means something far greater. Protection, care, responsibility, life." Clara nodded slowly. "You finally understand," she said softly. "And they finally have someone who will act consistently, with heart, not just obligation." He nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. Every tear he had shed that night, every pang of regret, every moment of reflection, had led to this, a glimpse of what it truly meant to be present, to nurture, to love. One of the infants stirred, tiny fingers grasping at his sleeve. He laughed again, more confidently this time, and whispered almost reverently, "I will not fail them again." Clara crossed the room and knelt beside him, smoothing the blankets over the babies. Her hand brushed lightly over his, connecting, steadying. "You won't," she said softly. "The past is gone, but the future. The future is yours to shape, consistently. Every day." He looked at her, searching her eyes. They were calm, strong, patient, the same eyes that had carried courage, resilience, and love through every obstacle, every betrayal, every absence. And now they were guiding him, not commanding, not judging, but offering a path he had never known he could take. He sighed, letting the weight of decades of mistakes slide off him, replaced slowly by resolve. It felt strange to be humbled, to be human, to be accountable, but it felt right, necessary, vital. Clara watched him, seeing the man who had once been ruthless, arrogant, untouchable, now learning, growing, opening his heart, one quiet moment at a time. Elias picked up one of the babies, cradling the tiny form carefully. He marveled at the fragility, the trust, the sheer miracle of life. This was not power, not control, not a transaction. It was responsibility, it was love, it was redemption. Clara sat beside him, her presence calm, grounding. "You've learned what it means to be present," she said, "and that is worth more than every empire you've built, every auction you've attended, every deal you've signed." The infants cooed and stirred, stretching their tiny limbs, filling the space with soft life. Elias looked down at them, whispering each name with care. He promised silently, fervently, in ways words could never capture. "I will protect you. I will love you. I will not fail again." Clara smiled faintly, a shadow of the triumph and sorrow of all she had endured. "You've finally learned," she said, Not through lectures, not through scolding, not through wealth or power, but through truth, through witnessing life you ignored, through choice. Elias nodded, a quiet humility grounding him. Tears slid down his cheeks once more, but now they were tempered with hope, with recognition, with the spark of change that could no longer be extinguished. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, a blanket of white, pure, and unassuming. It reflected the quiet miracle within these walls. A family formed not by wealth, not by power, not by convenience, but by love, courage, and choice. The Thorne name no longer stood for dominance. It stood for the lesson learned, too late for some, but not too late to matter here, now, today. Elias placed a small kiss on the forehead of one infant, a gesture tender, intimate, human. "I am sorry," he whispered, "but I will spend every day making it right." Clara placed her hand over his, steady, reassuring. "Actions will speak for you now," she said, "and they will define you more than words ever could." He nodded, meeting her eyes with gratitude, humility, and a quiet resolve. The journey ahead would be long, difficult, filled with challenges he had never imagined, but for the first time he welcomed it. The infants stirred again, and one let out a tiny laugh, breaking the stillness like sunlight through clouds. Elias smiled, soft, unpracticed, real, and in that moment he understood something profound. Redemption was not given. It was earned, through presence, through love, through unwavering, consistent care. Clara's smile deepened slightly. "The ending," she whispered softly, almost to herself, "isn't about punishment. It's about honesty, about choice, about love." He looked at her, truly looked, and felt the full weight of everything she had sacrificed, endured, and protected. "I will honor that," he said quietly, voice steady now. "Every day. For them. For her. For you." The infants reached tiny hands toward him, wrapping around his fingers, their trust absolute, their lives fragile yet resilient. Elias breathed deeply, letting the warmth, the love, the lessons settle into him. Outside, snow fell heavier now, drifting lazily to the ground. A quiet, soft promise of peace, renewal, and new beginnings. The kind that comes not from wealth, not from power, but from human courage, resilience, and the choices we make. And in that quiet, warm living room, surrounded by love and life, Elias finally understood. Legacy was not built by name, wealth, or dominance. It was built by presence, by courage, by love. As Elias cradled the last infant, a letter slipped quietly from Clara's sleeve, one she had kept secret all these months. Its contents held the final truth about the mother he abandoned, a revelation about the origins of the children, and a promise of something more. A choice he must make that would define not just his legacy, but the life of every soul he had once neglected. He opened it slowly, heart pounding, knowing that even now the final chapter of their story had yet to be written.